Tom Hanks walked into the restaurant, and at that exact moment, everyone stopped to judge who he seemed to be, not who he truly was. Under the golden glow of crystal chandeliers, he looked like an intruder. The scruffy beard, dark hair, slightly messy, and wrinkled black dress shirt made him invisible to those who only knew how to see status. But what no one there knew was that this simple man was the true owner of that place, and that tonight, he was there to witness something that would change everything. The dining room was full. Men in flawless suits and women in silk dresses toasted with crystal glasses in an atmosphere where every laugh sounded rehearsed, and every glance was a silent evaluation of who deserved to be there. Tom walked slowly to a corner table, silent, as if he didn't belong in that scene. He sat down alone, ignored by the glances that had quickly turned judgmental. Taking a deep breath, he looked around like a stranger in his own home. Emily Carter approached. Tall, firm posture, her black hair tied tightly in a high ponytail that swayed precisely with each determined step. The black vest over her crisp white shirt gave her an air of authority. Without a smile, without kindness, she stopped in front of him. She leaned forward, her sharp, cold eyes fixed on him. Pointing her finger at Tom, as if he were a problem to be solved, she said with thinly veiled contempt, "This is not the kind of place for someone like you." For a moment, Tom didn't react. There was a silence that felt like it weighed a ton. He slowly lifted his gaze to meet hers, and in that exchange, there was something Emily couldn't quite understand. Around them, other customers watched, some with disdain, others with twisted amusement, but none of them knew what was about to happen. And none of them would ever forget that moment. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe and like our channel. Now, let's get back to the story. The restaurant was called the Silver Ivy, a name whispered with reverence among the elite of New York. Its reputation was built on exclusivity, elegance, and perfection. Stepping inside was like entering another world, one where every inch was meticulously curated to exude power and refinement. Soft classical music floated through the air, blending with the faint clinking of cutlery and the murmur of privileged conversations. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm light, reflecting on polished marble floors and tables dressed in immaculate white linens. Each server moved with silent precision, their uniforms crisp, their smiles practiced but distant. It was a place where appearances mattered more than anything else. But beneath all that elegance, something colder lurked, something no one ever spoke about. Tom Hanks sat at a small table near the back wall, beneath a grand painting of a vineyard bathed in twilight. From this vantage point, he could see everything: the polished silverware, the gleaming wine glasses, and the guests who never looked twice at a man who didn't fit their image of importance. His wrinkled black shirt and tired eyes made him almost invisible, or worse, a target of quiet disdain. As he ran his fingers across the edge of the tablecloth, he could feel the weight of their judgment settling in. Yet his gaze remained steady, calmly observing the rhythms of a place he knew far better than anyone else there. No one questioned who he was. No one recognized him. At least, not yet. Emily Carter was the embodiment of the restaurant's standards. Her movements were efficient, her tone sharp but professional. Yet behind her cool exterior was a growing impatience. She had worked too hard to be where she was, and in her mind, men like Tom Hanks didn't belong there. They were a distraction, an inconvenience that disrupted the flawless facade she had spent years perfecting. As she leaned in toward him, the guests around them began to shift in their seats, sensing the tension brewing at that solitary table. Emily's voice was low enough not to be overheard, but her body language spoke volume. This wasn't a conversation, it was a warning. The room itself seemed to tighten as if holding its breath. Conversations quieted and the clinking of glasses slowed. Even the wait staff, trained to avoid distractions, stole glances at the corner where Emily stood confronting Tom. They didn't know who he was either. To them, he was just another outsider who had wandered in by mistake. But there was something in his stillness, in the quiet intensity of his gaze, that made a few of them hesitate. There was a story here, one they didn't understand yet, and something told them it wasn't going to end the way they expected. Tom's hands remained on the table, relaxed but purposeful. He didn't flinch when Emily pointed her finger again, or when a nearby guest shook his head with an audible sigh. There was something almost deliberate about his silence, as if he was waiting, watching. Emily, on the other hand, felt the pressure mounting. She had handled difficult customers before, but this was different. She couldn't explain why, but something about him unsettled her. Still, she pressed on, convinced she was doing her job, unaware of how close she was to making the biggest mistake of her life. And then, just as Emily opened her mouth to say something else, Tom finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was a weight to it that made her pause. Around them, people leaned in, hungry for the unfolding drama. Tom's eyes remained steady on hers, and for the first time that night, Emily felt a flicker of doubt. She didn't understand why, but something told her this wasn't just another man who didn't belong, and she was about to find out just how wrong she was. If you're feeling the tension rising, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Now, let's continue. Tom Hanks had never planned to return to the Silver Ivy in this way. Years ago, it had been his dream, a place he built from the ground up, pouring his soul into every brick, every polished glass, every menu item carefully crafted to tell a story. But time changes people. After stepping away from the public eye and giving his management team full control, he chose to live a quieter life. The fame, the interviews, the flashing cameras, all of it faded into the background. Tonight, though, something inside him needed to see it again, not as the owner, not as the celebrated figure everyone thought they knew, but as a man, tired, human, and searching for something even he couldn't quite explain. He wasn't expecting the cold reception, though maybe he should have. Sitting there, Tom could feel the distance between the man he was now and the image the world had built of him. They expected him to be polished, smiling, the perfect gentleman they had seen on screens for decades, but tonight his beard was rough, his clothes worn. It was a test, though he wouldn't have called it that. It was a quiet question he was asking the world around him. Would they still see him? Or had he become invisible without the trappings of wealth and fame? Emily Carter's reaction was answering that question in real time, and it stung more than he expected. As Emily stood there, pointing her finger at him, Tom's mind drifted back to his earliest days. The days when he had been no different from her, working late nights, taking every shift he could to save a few extra dollars. He knew what it was like to feel invisible, to be dismissed by people who thought they were better than him. That memory had shaped him. It was why he had once treated everyone in his life with kindness, no matter their status. But somewhere along the way, he had distanced himself. And now, watching Emily act as gatekeeper to a world he had created, he realized how far that world had drifted from his original dream. There was something heavy in Tom's chest as he studied Emily. He didn't see a villain. He saw someone trying to survive in a place that demanded perfection and punished weakness. She was doing what she thought was necessary to protect the image of the restaurant. But in doing so, she was losing sight of something deeper, something that had once mattered most to him: respect. Not respect for titles or appearances, but for the person sitting quietly across from you, waiting to be seen. And Tom wondered how many others had been turned away by that same coldness. For Tom, it wasn't about the humiliation. It wasn't about pride. He had nothing left to prove. What gnawed at him was the realization that this place, his place, had become the very thing he had once fought against. A sanctuary for the privileged, a stage where compassion had been replaced by judgment. He had come here to remember what it felt like to be part of it again. But instead, he found himself a stranger in a home he no longer recognized. And Emily Carter was the mirror reflecting that uncomfortable truth back at him. But even as he sat there, feeling the sting of her words, Tom knew this wasn't the end of the story. There was still something he had to do, a message he needed to deliver. And though Emily didn't know it yet, her life, and the life of everyone watching, was about to change. What would happen next wasn't anger, it wasn't revenge, it was something far more powerful, and it was coming. Emily Carter tightened her grip on the order pad in her hand, the edge of the leather cover digging into her palm as she forced herself to maintain control. The weight of the room's attention pressed against her shoulders, but she didn't back down. Every second that passed with Tom Hanks sitting at that table in his disheveled state felt like a challenge to the restaurant's reputation. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a sharp whisper that still carried enough edge to cut. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," she said, glancing around to make sure the other guests saw her taking action. Her tone was firm, rehearsed, the same way she had been trained to handle people who didn't fit. But something in Tom's expression stopped her cold for a fraction of a second, a calm she couldn't explain. Across the room, other diners shifted in their seats, watching the interaction with poorly concealed interest. A man in an expensive black suit whispered something to his wife, his lips curling into a faint, superior smile. The forks and knives stilled in midair as people waited to see if the stranger would comply or cause a scene. Even the maitre d', a tall man named Richard, stood frozen by the entrance, unsure whether to intervene or let Emily handle it. No one, not a single person, recognized Tom, not as the famous actor, not as the man behind the name on the deed of the restaurant. And Tom didn't correct them. Not yet. He wanted to see it play out. He needed to understand how deep the problem went. Tom's hand moved slowly, reaching for the coffee cup that Emily had slammed on the table minutes earlier. His fingers wrapped around the delicate porcelain, and he lifted it to his lips with deliberate calm. The coffee was cold now, untouched. He took a small sip anyway. Emily bristled, interpreting his calm as defiance. "I won't ask you again," she warned, her jaw tightening. But even as she said it, doubt began to creep in. Something about the way he moved, the way he looked at her, made her second-guess her own certainty. Still, she pushed it down. She had a job to do, and appearances mattered more than feelings here. At least, that's what she kept telling herself. And then Tom spoke again, softly, but clearly. "What's your name?" The question threw Emily off balance. She blinked, unsure whether to answer. "Emily," she said after a long pause, her voice hesitant for the first time. Tom nodded slowly, as if filing away a detail he already knew. "Emily Carter," he repeated. "How long have you worked here?" Another question she wasn't expecting. She glanced around, sensing the audience their exchange had gathered. 3 years, she replied stiffly. Tom gave her a small, knowing smile, but it wasn't condescending. It was something else, something that made her chest tighten in ways she couldn't name. And for the first time, she felt like she was standing on unstable ground. Meanwhile, the whispers around the room grew louder. Some guests were clearly annoyed, others intrigued. Richard, the maitre d', finally stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floor as he approached the table. "Is there a problem here, Emily?" he asked smoothly, his eyes flicking between them. Emily straightened, grateful for the backup. "I was just asking this gentleman to leave," she said. Tom set the coffee cup down with a soft clink. "And why would that be?" he asked Richard calmly. Richard hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Well, he's not exactly dressed appropriately," Emily cut in quickly. But something in Richard's face shifted. A flicker of recognition? No, just hesitation. No one knew who they were really dealing with. Not yet. The tension was so thick it felt like the chandeliers themselves might crack under the pressure. Tom leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes never leaving Emily's. "I think we need to have a conversation," he said quietly, but his words carried a gravity that silenced even the nearby tables. Emily swallowed hard. She had no idea what kind of conversation he meant. All she knew was that the room was watching, waiting for her next move. She was no longer sure what the right one was. And somewhere deep inside, a sliver of fear crept in. Not of punishment, but of realizing she might have misjudged everything. And if she had, what came next could change everything. Richard stood there, his polished exterior cracking ever so slightly as Tom Hanks's quiet statement lingered in the air. "I think we need to have a conversation." There was something about the tone, something that pulled at Richard's memory. He glanced again at Tom, searching for a clue, a hint of recognition that tugged at something distant and almost forgotten. But before he could speak, Tom stood up, slowly, deliberately. His movements weren't rushed, but they carried a weight that shifted the energy in the entire room. People stopped pretending not to watch. Their gazes locked on him as if sensing a moment they would tell others about later, though they didn't yet understand why. "And Emily?" She took a step back without realizing it. "I'm sorry," Tom said softly. Not to Emily, not to Richard, but to the room itself, to everyone who had sat there quietly judging without knowing who they were looking at. "I never wanted it to be this way." His words hung there, confusing some, unsettling others. Richard furrowed his brow. "Sir," he began cautiously, "who exactly are you?" Tom's eyes drifted to him, calm but piercing. And then, before he could answer, another voice cut through the tension. It was Margaret, the head chef, who had just stepped out from behind the kitchen doors. Her white coat was dusted with flour, her hands stained from hours of preparation. She froze when she saw Tom, and in that second, everything changed. "Tom?" Margaret's voice cracked, louder than she intended. She wiped her hands quickly on her apron, stepping forward as her eyes filled with disbelief. Is that really you?" The kitchen doors swung shut behind her with a dull thud, making her question echo louder than anyone expected. Richard turned, startled. Emily's breath caught in her throat. And now, every single person in the dining room was staring, some mouths slightly open, others whispering frantic questions to their companions. Margaret didn't wait. She crossed the room with urgency, standing before Tom like someone who had found something precious they thought was lost. "I didn't know you were here," she whispered, the emotion in her voice undeniable. Emily's mind reeled. She looked from Margaret to Tom, confusion and sudden fear crashing together inside her. "You know him?" she asked, her voice tight. Margaret's laugh was quiet, but filled with something that bordered on heartbreak. "Know him?" she echoed, glancing around as if the answer should be obvious. "This is Tom Hanks. He's not just some customer. He's the man who built this place. The Silver Ivy wouldn't exist without him." Her words were simple, but they hit like a hammer. Emily's stomach dropped. The room tilted slightly as her hands went cold. Everything she thought she understood crumbled in an instant, and all she could do was stand there, trying to process the truth that had just shattered her reality. But Tom didn't gloat. He didn't bask in the shock or the shame flickering across the faces around him. Instead, he looked at Emily with something closer to sadness than anger. "You're good at your job," he said quietly. "You keep things in order. You protect the image. I know how hard that is." Emily's throat tightened, but she couldn't look away. "But you forgot something," Tom continued. His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it that settled heavy on her chest. This place wasn't built on appearances. It was built on respect, on kindness, on welcoming people, no matter how they looked when they walked through that door. And for the first time, Emily realized how wrong she had been. But she also knew the conversation wasn't over yet. Richard stepped back, as if giving space for something sacred. Margaret stayed where she was, silent now, letting Tom speak. The entire room was silent too. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others lowered their eyes. Emily finally found her voice, though it was thin. I didn't know," she whispered. Tom nodded, not to dismiss her, but to acknowledge her honesty. "I know," he replied, "but now you do." And in that simple exchange, something inside Emily broke, and something new began to form. A lesson, sharp and clear, that would stay with her for the rest of her life. But the hardest part was still ahead. What Tom would do next, no one could predict. Emily Carter stood frozen, her fingers still curled around the order pad, though she no longer felt its weight. Her world had shifted, as if the marble floor beneath her had tilted just enough to leave her unsteady. She watched Tom Hanks, not the disheveled man she had dismissed, but the man whose name was woven into the very fabric of the silver ivy, take a quiet breath, as if lifting a burden that had rested on his shoulders for too long. Shame flooded through her chest like cold water, sudden and paralyzing. She hadn't just insulted a customer. She had forgotten why she ever wanted to work there in the first place. And as the silence stretched around her, Emily realized something even worse. This wasn't the first time. The other guests were still watching, though now their expressions had softened into something resembling discomfort rather than scorn. Emily saw it, and it only deepened the ache in her chest. All those years of striving for perfection, for control, and in the end, it had made her blind. She had chased the image of success, believing it meant being strong, assertive, and unyielding. But now, standing in front of the man who had created this place with compassion and respect, she understood just how far she had drifted from her own values. The weight of that realization pressed down on her shoulders, but there was also something else. A spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. The possibility of change. Tom's words echoed in her mind. Respect, kindness. They sounded so simple, but in this room filled with quiet judgments and cold elegance, they were revolutionary. Emily felt her throat tighten as she looked around, seeing the restaurant differently for the first time. The chandeliers still glowed. The linen tablecloths were still pristine, but the atmosphere had shifted. Guests whispered more softly now. Some lowered their eyes, no longer watching like spectators at a show. Margaret still stood nearby, her gaze steady on Emily, as if waiting to see what choice she would make next. Emily swallowed hard. She knew she had to speak. "But what do you say when you've just been shown the worst parts of yourself?" She took a breath, stepping forward slowly, as if crossing into unfamiliar territory. "Mr. Hanks," she began, her voice soft but steadying with each word, "I was wrong." Simple words, but they felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Tom looked at her, his expression calm, almost gentle. Emily continued, "I thought I was doing my job. I thought protecting the restaurant meant protecting appearances." Her throat tightened again, but she didn't stop. "But I see now that I've been turning people away, people who probably needed to be seen the most." There was a flicker of something in Tom's eyes then. Approval, maybe, or understanding. And Emily realized she wasn't speaking just to him. She was speaking to herself. Around them, the room felt warmer somehow. The tension that had gripped the air was fading, replaced by something softer. Richard gave a quiet nod of acknowledgement, his usual smooth facade replaced by a more human expression. Margaret smiled faintly, but didn't interrupt. Emily glanced around at the guests who had been watching. Some nodded silently in approval. Others returned to their meals with a new kind of quiet respect. Emily felt a weight lift from her chest, not because everything was fixed, but because she had finally seen the truth, and that was where change could begin. But she knew this was only the first step. The real work was just starting. Tom Hanks gave a small smile. "You'll do fine, Emily," he said quietly, "if you remember why you're here." His words weren't grand, but they carried a weight that settled deep inside her. She nodded once, feeling the sting of tears she refused to let fall. And then, without fanfare, Tom turned and walked toward the exit. No anger, no dramatic exit, just quiet dignity. Emily watched him go, knowing she had been given something precious, a second chance. And this time, she wouldn't waste it. But as the door closed softly behind him, She couldn't help but wonder, had she learned the lesson in time? As Tom Hanks walked out of the Silver Ivy, the heavy door closing gently behind him, Emily Carter stood motionless, staring at the space where he had been. It was as if the entire world had gone quiet for a moment. Slowly, she drew in a shaky breath, realizing that everything felt different now. The elegant chandeliers still cast their warm glow, and the fine linen tablecloths still draped flawlessly over every table. But something had shifted in the air, something she couldn't explain. It wasn't the decor or the prestige of the place that mattered anymore. It was the people inside it, and how they were seen. And for the first time in years, Emily truly saw them. Margaret approached her slowly, wiping her hands on her apron again, though they were already clean. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Emily nodded, but her throat felt tight. She didn't trust herself to speak yet. Margaret gave a small, understanding smile, then turned back toward the kitchen, leaving Emily with her thoughts. Across the room, the diners began to relax again, but now their conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. Richard returned to his post by the entrance, though he glanced at Emily with something different in his eyes, a respect that hadn't been there before. And Emily stood in the middle of it all, understanding she had just crossed a threshold she couldn't uncross. In the days that followed, Emily changed. Not in the obvious ways. Her uniform was still crisp, her ponytail still perfectly tied, but in the way she looked at people. She smiled more. She took the time to ask guests how they were doing, not because it was protocol, but because she genuinely wanted to know. She noticed the small things, the nervous glances, the hesitant steps of those who weren't sure they belonged, and each time she made sure they knew they did. The Silver Ivy slowly became warmer, not just elegant. People noticed, and word spread, though not about Tom Hanks or the night he was insulted. It was something quieter, something deeper. People felt it. Emily kept thinking about Tom's final words. "Remember why you're here." They echoed in her every action, guiding her like a compass. She realized now that she hadn't come to the Silver Ivy just to serve food or climb a career ladder. She had come because she wanted to be part of something meaningful, something bigger than herself. She had forgotten that along the way, blinded by appearances and rules. But now, with every guest she welcomed and every kindness she offered, she was building something new, not just for herself, but for everyone who walked through those doors. Months later, Emily stood by the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived for a special event. She noticed a man in a simple jacket, his hands tucked into his pockets, hesitating near the doorway. Without a second thought, she stepped forward, smiling warmly, and said, "Welcome. We're glad you're here." The man's shoulders relaxed, his expression softening as he entered. Emily watched him take a seat, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle in her chest. This was the place Tom Hanks had dreamed of, and now it was becoming that place again. Not because of fame or fortune, but because people mattered here. As she glanced toward the far end of the room, she thought she saw Tom watching from a distance, his familiar gentle smile on his face. But when she looked again, there was no one there. Maybe it was just her imagination, or maybe it was something else. Either way, she smiled to herself and returned to her work, knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And for the first time in a long time, Emily Carter felt proud, not of the restaurant, but of who she had become inside it. There are moments in life when we are given a choice, whether to see people as they appear on the surface or to look deeper. Emily Carter learned that lesson the hard way. She realized that it's easy to make judgments based on what someone wears, how they speak, or where they come from. But what's harder, and infinitely more important, is choosing to see the person underneath all of that. Tom Hanks walked into the Silver Ivy, looking like he didn't belong, and for a moment, Emily believed he didn't. But behind that worn-out shirt and tired expression was a story, a heart, and a legacy that had built everything around her, and she almost missed it. We live in a world that teaches us to value appearances, to believe that success is measured by how perfect we seem, rather than how deeply we care. Emily had spent years thinking that professionalism meant being strict, guarded, and distant. She had learned to protect the image of her workplace at all costs, even if it meant closing herself off from genuine connection. But in doing so, she had also closed herself off from compassion. Tom Hanks didn't just remind her of what the Silver Ivy was supposed to stand for. He reminded her of who she was supposed to be. And in that moment, everything changed. Respect isn't something you give to people because they earn it with wealth or titles. It's something you offer because they're human. Because every person who crosses your path has a story you don't know yet. Tom Hanks sat at that table quietly, not expecting special treatment, but hoping, just hoping, that someone would see him as a person first. And for a time, Emily didn't. But she learned. And in learning, she grew. That's all any of us can do when we realize we've made a mistake. We grow. We become better, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Every person you meet is fighting a battle you can't see. Some carry their burdens quietly, like Tom did. Some are just trying to find a place where they feel welcome. And others are holding on by a thread, waiting for a sign that they matter. Emily understood that now. She understood that a simple gesture, an open door, a warm smile, a kind word, can change the course of someone's day, or even their life. And it doesn't cost anything to offer that grace to someone. It's not about grand gestures. It's about the little moments where you choose to see someone, really see them. The Silver Ivy became more than just a place for fine dining. It became a place where people mattered. Emily made sure of that every single day. And even though Tom Hanks didn't come back again, his presence was still felt in every decision she made, in every welcome she offered. She knew now that the greatest success wasn't in maintaining perfection, but in making people feel seen, valued, and respected. And in doing so, she became the kind of person she had once forgotten how to be. Someone who chose kindness every time. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us, to slow down, to look beyond appearances, to remember that no one is less deserving of dignity because of how they look or how they seem in a single moment. Because sometimes the person sitting quietly in the corner is the one who built the entire room you're standing in. And if we don't take the time to see them, we risk losing something far greater than we can imagine. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more emotional stories that inspire and heal. Until next time.